I want you to imagine a political cartoon, but not one from today.
Okay.
Picture one from the 18th century. In this drawing, there is a nobleman, and he is depicted as this like giant, terrifying spider.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and caught right in the middle of his web is a peasant, drawn as a helpless, trapped fly. At the bottom, there is a simple, chilling caption: "The more the devil has, the more he wants."
It is such a visceral image. I
It's
mean, it captures the psychological boiling point of an entire society better than any spreadsheet ever could.
Absolutely. And welcome to your custom deep dive. Today's mission is designed specifically for you, focusing on a really fascinating stack of historical texts covering the French Revolution.
It's a heavy topic, but a crucial one.
Definitely. We are going to look at how the concepts we completely take for granted today, things like, liberty, freedom, and equality, were not just magically handed down to us.
Right, they definitely weren't.
They were forged through immense turmoil, incredible violence, and radical world-altering change.
And to really understand how a society reaches that breaking point, we need to set the baseline context. We have to go back to the year 1774.
Could take the picture for us.
So, picture this. A 20-year-old young man, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family, ascends to the throne of France. He's married to an Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette.
Right.
He inherits a massive, sprawling kingdom, but he immediately discovers a catastrophic problem. The national treasury is completely empty.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when we say empty, how deep is this financial hole? I mean, every country has some debt, right?
Yeah, but this wasn't just typical government debt. It was staggering. We were talking about long years of war that had thoroughly drained the country's financial resources.
Wow.
Add to that the immense ongoing cost of maintaining an unbelievably extravagant court at the Palace of Versailles.
Which is not cheap.
Not at all. And then, under Louis XVI, France decides to help the 13 American colonies gain their independence from Britain, who was their common enemy.
Wait, so they are funding a war across the Atlantic while they are already broke?
Exactly. That war alone added more than 1 billion livres to a national debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion livres.
2 billion. That's absurd.
And the lenders, who were giving the state credit, they saw the risk. So they started charging a 10% interest rate on the loans.
10%?
10%. The French government was suddenly forced to spend an increasing, completely unsustainable percentage of its entire budget just paying the interest on the debt.
Which means they have to find cash fast. You need money to maintain an army, run the court, fund universities, keep government offices open. So how do they get it?
Well, they looked to extract it from the people. But French society, what is known as the old regime, was structurally engineered to extract that revenue in the most unfair way imaginable.
How so?
Society was legally divided into 3 categories called estates.
Break down that math for us. Who is actually in these estates?
The first estate, that was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. And the third estate was literally everyone else.
Okay.
Peasants made up about 90% of the entire population. But despite being the vast majority, only a very small fraction of them actually owned the land they cultivated.
Really? So who owned it?
About 60% of all the land in France was owned by nobles, the church, and a few richer members of that third estate.
Let me try and put this in a modern perspective for you listening. It's like playing a rigged game of Monopoly.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Imagine you sit down at the board, but 2 of the players, the first and second estates, start the game already owning 60% of the properties.
Right.
They don't have to roll the dice, and they are completely exempt from paying any taxes by right of birth. Meanwhile, you, playing as the third estate, are forced to pay them a fee every time you pass go. You are structurally engineered to lose.
That is exactly the mechanism of feudalism. The peasants didn't just lack privilege, they actively financed the privileges of the rich.
Man, that's brutal.
It gets worse. The third estate had to pay a direct tax to the state called the taille. But the trap goes deeper. They paid indirect taxes levied on everyday survival items, like salt and tobacco.
So they're taxed just for existing.
Yeah, and the church extracted its own share of tax called a tithe, which was literally 1/10 of all their agricultural produce.
Yeah.
The poorest people carried the entire financial weight of the nation.
And as if that systemic crushing wasn't enough, basic demographics step in to make it worse, don't they?
They do. The population of France absolutely boomed. It rose from about 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789.
That is 5 million more mouths to feed in a system that is already failing.
Precisely. It caused a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. But agricultural production couldn't keep pace.
Right.
Add in a series of bad harvests, and the price of bread, which was the absolute staple diet of the majority, skyrocketed.
And I'm guessing wages didn't go up to match.
Nope. Wages for laborers working in workshops were fixed. Their income wasn't keeping up with the rising prices. It led to a full-blown subsistence crisis. The poorest people literally could no longer afford to buy bread to survive.
Well, you have a starving population, a rigged economic system, and a historically broke king. I mean, that is a massive powder keg. Who lights the match?
Actually, it was the king's brilliant solution to all of this. Faced with this massive debt and a starving public, Louis XVI plans to impose even more taxes.
Unbelievable. He decides to squeeze the one group that has absolutely nothing left to give.
Yeah, that plan is what finally causes the Third Estate to snap. The representatives of the Third Estate view themselves as spokesmen for the whole French nation.
Right.
In June of 1789, they walk out in protest and assemble in an indoor tennis court on the grounds of Versailles.
Ah, the famous tennis court oath.
Exactly. They declare themselves a national assembly and swear not to leave until they have drafted a constitution that limits the monarch's power.
But who is actually leading this walkout? Is it just like angry farmers?
That's the fascinating part. It was led by a man named Mirabeau, who was actually born into a noble family but was convinced they had to end feudal privilege.
Wait, a noble?
Yes, and alongside him was Abbé Sieyès, who was originally a priest. Sieyès even wrote a hugely influential pamphlet called What is the Third Estate?
Wow. It really shows that the ideas of the Enlightenment, the writings of philosophers pushing for a society based on merit rather than birth, had crossed over class lines. Even some of the elites knew the system was fundamentally broken.
They did. But while the assembly is busy at Versailles drafting legal documents, the rest of France is boiling over. The winter had been severe, harvests were bad, bakers were exploiting the situation and hoarding supplies.
And this is where the paper revolution turns into physical violence.
Yes, it is.
On the morning of July 14th, 1789, rumors spread that the king had commanded troops to move into Paris and fire upon the citizens.
The people realized they need to defend themselves. They form a militia, but a militia needs weapons and gunpowder. That is why they specifically targeted the Bastille. It was the fortress prison that stood for the despotic power of the king, but more importantly, they believed it held the ammunition they needed. They stormed it and literally tore it down to its stone fragments.
And how does the rest of the country react to Paris falling into chaos?
The violence ripples outward through a phenomenon known as the Great Fear. Without modern communication, rumors distorted and amplified as they traveled from village to village.
Oh, the whisper down the lane effect.
Exactly. Peasants heard terrifying whispers that lords of manors had hired bands of brigands to destroy their ripe crops. Driven by panic, the peasants grabbed pitchforks and hoes, attacked chateaux, and looted hoarded grain.
It's pure survival mode.
And most crucially, they burned down the very documents that contained the records of their manorial dues.
They are literally burning the ledgers of their own oppression. The system is collapsing in real time. Nobles flee the country. And Louis XVI finally realizes he is beaten.
He has no choice.
Right. He recognizes the National Assembly and accepts that his powers will be checked by a constitution, which they finished drafting in 1791.
And the Constitution of 1791 was a monumental shift. It abolished the feudal system of obligations and taxes, the clergy were forced to give up their privileges, the tithes were abolished, and church lands were confiscated.
So they essentially strip the CEO of his absolute control and put him under the authority of a board of directors, which is something the French people had never experienced before. France is officially a constitutional monarchy.
And it is anchored by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Rights to life, freedom of speech, equality before the law, all declared as natural and inalienable rights belonging to every human being by birth.
Wait, hold on. This is where the texts get really contradictory.
How so?
They just swore an oath to liberty. They literally tore down a prison in the name of equality, but their new constitution immediately invents a system of active and passive citizens. How did they justify that hypocrisy?
You're hitting on the core paradox of this entire era. The Constitution vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. But they decided not everyone could vote.
Of course not.
To be an active citizen and get the right to vote, you had to be a man over 25 years of age, and you had to pay taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage.
So they basically swapped a society based on birth privilege for a society based on wealth privilege. Millions of poor men and all women were excluded entirely.
Completely. They were classed as passive citizens with no voting rights whatsoever. And this hypocrisy did not go unnoticed. The revolutionary journalist Jean-Paul Marat wrote a scathing critique in his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, or The Friend of the People.
What did he say?
He warned the assembly, writing, "The task of representing the people has been given to the rich. The lot of the poor and oppressed will never be improved by peaceful means alone. Here we have absolute proof of how wealth influences the law." He goes on, "Yet laws will last only as long as the people agree to obey them. And when they have managed to cast off the yoke of the aristocrats, they will do the same to the other owners of wealth."
Marat is telling them, you think the revolution is over because you wrote a document. You just painted a target on your own backs.
And he was absolutely right.
Because right after this, the tension explodes outward. Neighboring kings in Prussia and Austria are terrified that these revolutionary ideas will cross their borders, so they make plans to send troops.
But the National Assembly strikes first. They declare war against Prussia and Austria in 1792. And this war fundamentally changes the cultural psychology of the revolution.
Right, because the people volunteering for the army didn't see this as a typical border dispute between monarchs. They viewed it as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe.
It was a massive mobilization of ideology. Volunteers from Marseille marched into Paris, singing a deeply patriotic song composed by the poet Roger de Lisle.
The Marseillaise.
Yes, which is actually the national anthem of France today. But while the men are off fighting this ideological war, the economic realities at home are deteriorating.
Which brings us back to Marat's warning. The poorer sections of society realized the Constitution of 1791 gave them absolutely no political power to fix their starving reality. So political clubs become the gathering point to discuss pushing the revolution further.
And the most successful of these was the Jacobin Club. And their demographic was radically different from the wealthy men who wrote the Constitution.
Who were they?
The Jacobins represented the less prosperous sections of society. We were talking about small shopkeepers, shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, and daily wage workers. Their leader was a man named Maximilien Robespierre.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Jacobins didn't just change the political discourse, they changed the visual landscape of Paris. A large group of them decided to start wearing long striped trousers, very similar to what dock workers wore.
Yeah, they wanted to visibly, physically separate themselves from the fashionable sections of society, especially the nobles who traditionally wore knee breeches. They literally became known as the sans-culottes, meaning those without knee breeches. In addition, the men wore a red cap that symbolized liberty.
It shows us that a true revolution isn't just about changing laws, it's about changing culture. Fashion literally became a weapon of class warfare.
And this radicalized working class takes devastating action. In the summer of 1792, angered by short supplies and high food prices, they stormed the Palace of the Tuileries.
Oh, wow.
They massacre the king's guards and hold Louis XVI hostage for hours.
The constitutional monarchy is dead. The assembly votes to imprison the royal family. They hold new elections, and this time, all men 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. No more active and passive citizens.
They form a newly elected assembly called the Convention. On September 21st, 1792, they abolish the monarchy entirely and declare France a republic. Louis XVI is tried for treason, found guilty, and publicly executed by guillotine.
So the king is dead. Does that finally fix the food shortage and bring peace to the country?
The exact opposite. With the king dead and the external wars still raging against European monarchs, the new republic becomes deeply, dangerously paranoid about internal enemies. And this directly launches what we now call the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794.
That sounds terrifying.
It was. Robespierre takes absolute control of the government and initiates a policy of severe control and punishment.
Put yourself in Paris in 1793. Anyone Robespierre saw as an enemy of the Republic, ex-nobles, clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own Jacobin party who just disagreed with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and tried by a revolutionary tribunal.
And if you were found guilty, the sentence was the guillotine. That infamous device with 2 holes and a dropping blade, named after Dr. Guillotine, it was industrial-scale execution.
But the psychological toll went so much deeper than just the executions, right? The micro-level controls over everyday life were astonishing. Robespierre's government placed strict maximum ceilings on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced by law to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government.
They even banned white flour. Everyone, regardless of status, was required to eat something called pain d'égalité, or equality bread, which was a single, state-mandated loaf made of whole wheat.
I mean, they even mandated how you could speak to your neighbors. The traditional titles of Monsieur and Madame were outlawed. Every single French man and woman had to be addressed as citoyen and citoyenne citizen.
It's wild.
And churches were shut down, and their historic buildings were converted into military barracks or government offices.
It is total societal engineering. But what's fascinating here is how the sources capture the internal debate about the meaning of liberty itself. We have two conflicting views from the text that perfectly illustrate this.
Let's hear them.
On one hand, you have the journalist Camille Desmoulins. In 1793, he wrote, "Some people believe that liberty is like a child, which needs to go through a phase of being disciplined before it attains maturity. Quite the opposite." He continues, "Liberty is happiness, reason, equality, justice. You would like to finish off all your enemies by guillotining them. Has anyone heard of something more senseless?"
Desmoulins is arguing that you cannot build a free society through murder and extreme control, but Robespierre has the exact opposite view.
Yes. In a speech to the convention in 1794, Robespierre openly defended the terror. He argued, to establish and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must first finish the war of liberty against tyranny.
The war of liberty against tyranny, he is literally saying, we have to be tyrants now so that we can have liberty later.
Yeah.
That is a terrifying logic. And eventually it pushed his own supporters to the breaking point. His policies were so relentless that people demanded moderation. In July 1794, the system turned on him. Robespierre was convicted by a court, arrested, and sent to the very guillotine he'd used on so many others.
And with the fall of Robespierre, the central government fractures again. But the deep dive here isn't just about the men in the assembly fighting for control in Paris. As these massive shifts were happening, the ideals of the revolution were rippling out to marginalized groups.
Oh, absolutely.
They took these concepts of liberty and equality and applied them to their own lives.
Yes, the unfinished revolutions within the revolution. Take women's roles, for example. We gloss over this, but
Yeah.
women were active participants from the very beginning.
They were.
Remember the events of October 1789? Women from Paris marched all the way to Versailles and literally brought the king back with them. They formed their own political clubs to demand equal rights, flat out refusing to just accept that passive citizen label the men had given them.
And we also see a profound systemic shift regarding slavery. One of the most significant social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies.
Right, because France held colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo.
Exactly. These were massive economic engines supplying tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee to Europe.
But the mechanism of that entire economy relied on a massive contradiction. I mean, Paris is declaring that all men are born free, but the empire relies on the brutal exploitation of enslaved people to harvest the sugar and coffee.
Exactly. Because Europeans were reluctant to go work in those distant, unfamiliar lands, the entire plantation system relied on enslaved labor. But the philosophy of the revolution fundamentally broke that model.
Right.
The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. It wasn't until 1794 that the convention finally legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions.
And back in everyday French life, there's another huge mechanism of change, the abolition of censorship.
This is a crucial pivot point. Under the old regime, every single book, newspaper, or play had to be explicitly approved by the king's censors before it could be published. The flow of information was entirely controlled by the crown.
Which gives them all the power.
Right. But once the Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed freedom of speech and expression as a natural right, those floodgates opened.
The streets were absolutely flooded with newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures. These materials traveled rapidly from the towns into the countryside.
Yeah, it was everywhere.
The mechanism of change is literally just this flood of uncensored print hitting the streets, bringing the debate about everyday events right into the hands of regular people. You could finally write what you thought without the king's permission.
But as with everything in this era, the pendulum always swings back. After the Jacobins fell and Robespierre was executed, The wealthier middle classes seized power again.
Back to square one.
Sort of.
Yeah.
They introduced a new constitution that once again denied the vote to the non-propertied sections of society. They set up 2 elected legislative councils, which then appointed a 5-member executive called the Directory. The idea was to prevent another one-man dictatorship like the one they just survived.
Let me guess. Dividing power between 2 councils and a 5-member executive immediately led to gridlock.
It was constant political instability. The directors constantly clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that structural instability of the Directory is exactly what paved the way for a military dictator to eventually step in and seize control.
Napoleon Bonaparte. It's
Exactly.
like a tragic circle. They start with an absolute monarch, they endure a decade of terror and revolution, and they end up with an emperor. So, does that mean the entire revolution was a failure?
The texts make it clear that it was not a failure. Despite the rise of Napoleon, the core ideals of the revolution, freedom, equality before the law, and fraternity survived.
Right.
They permanently changed the language of politics and remained the inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe for the entire following century.
And for you listening, I think this deep dive really highlights something critical. The rights we enjoy today, the very concepts of democratic equality, weren't just politely given to us by a benevolent ruler. They were demanded, they were negotiated, and they were bitterly fought over by people who are quite literally starving for change. History isn't just a list of dates. It's the story of people pushing back against the web they are trapped in.
Which brings us full circle to that spider and the fly.
It does. The French Revolution shows us a terrifying pivot point. The fight for freedom transformed into a regime of total control and paranoia during the terror, all in the name of protecting that very same freedom.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to mull over. Look at the modern world today. When a society faces a massive crisis, how often do we still see leaders use the exact same logic as Robespierre, arguing that we must temporarily suspend liberty in order to save it?
A chilling but entirely relevant question.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you on the next one.